was in Moscow today, and Lavrov, some of the statements that came out of Russia today, in fact, came during those meetings. And President Putin made a statement during his phone call with Erdogan, talking about already having Mariupol in his hands. My question is, do you think the world leaders' communications with Russian leaders should be preconditioned with getting out of Ukraine first before we communicate with you?
We believe this war has to be brought to a close through dialogue and diplomacy. And we've consistently said that we support diplomatic efforts that are done in full coordination. In the first instance with Ukraine, that's most important because these are not choices that will be the purview of any other country, any other international organization. The Ukrainian government, an expression of the will of the Ukrainian people, ultimately is going to have to be the entity that makes decisions that affect its country going forward. So whether it's the efforts of the Turkish government, of the German government, of the Israeli government, of the French government, of other governments who have used their good offices or offered their auspices for dialogue between the parties or attempted to shuttle between Russia and Ukraine, we support those efforts as long as they're done in full coordination with our Ukrainian partners. Yes.
Thank you, Ned. A couple of questions about the secondary sanctions. This is something that the Secretary was asked at today's hearing at the Senate. As the leaked phone calls suggested yesterday, sanctioned Russian oligarch, who is one of the major architects of this war, Mr. Evtushenko, and Georgia's richest man, oligarch Ivanishvili, who controls the Georgian politics from the shadow, they are figuring out the ways to bypass the sanctions and secure supply of vital grain products to Russia. Evtushenko himself confirmed the authenticity of this conversation in the interview with the Georgian media. Based on these leaked phone calls, David Arahamian, who is a leading Ukrainian politician who chairs the negotiations with Russia, he appealed to the Western leaders to consider imposing personal sanctions on Ivanishvili and his assets in the West. Does the U.S. track or assess these phone calls, this leaked phone conversation? Do you have any assessment of that? And what would be your response to that? When it comes to imposing secondary sanctions to those countries or institutions who are helping Russia or Belarus, bypass these harsh measures.
So I'm not in a position to speak to any purportedly leaked phone call or to confirm the authenticity or not of what you're referring to, but a couple points. Not only have we leveled sanctions and other tools against those who are responsible for the Kremlin's decision to go into Ukraine, those in Russia, those in Ukraine, but last week we announced a large tranche of sanctions against those responsible for facilitating sanctions evasion. And so sanctions evasion is something that we are taking a very close look at around the world, whether that's in Russia, whether that's in Belarus, whether that is anywhere else around the world. And I think our actions last week demonstrated that we will go after those networks, those entities, those individuals who are willfully, deliberately, systematically evading or helping others to evade these sanctions. Of course, I'm not in a position to preview sanctions on any individual or any specific entities, but it's something we're taking a very close look at. Yes, Jane.
Thank you, Nate. I have two questions on South and North Korea.
Can I ask about Ukraine?
North
Ukraine?
Sure. Before we go on to another region, we'll take a couple final Ukraine questions. We need to, Connor?
After Secretary Blinken announced, on Monday, that the State Department would return some diplomats to Lviv this week. Can you confirm whether or not that has started today and if they successfully made the journey back to Poland today?
I can confirm that. The Deputy Chief of Mission and members of the embassy team traveled to Lviv, Ukraine today, where they were able to continue our close collaboration with key Ukrainian partners. Today they met with interlocutors from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As Secretary Blinken announced yesterday, our diplomats are returning and have returned to Ukraine this week on a temporary basis. Today's travel was a first step ahead of more regular travel in the immediate future. And as we've said, we're accelerating preparations to resume Embassy Kyiv operations just as soon as possible. We are constantly assessing and evaluating and reassessing the security situation with a view towards resuming those embassy operations as soon as possible, again, to facilitate our support to the government and people of Ukraine as they bravely defend their country.
On
Yep.
Bridget Brink being finally nominated, what took so long? It's been, over a year into this administration. You said you've prioritized this relationship. Why did it take so long to get a nomination here?
Well, the fact is that we haven't had, unfortunately, an ambassador in Ukraine in several years now. And of course, need not go into why we didn't have an ambassador there in the first place. But there are processes both within our government and coordination with the host country government, in this case, our Ukrainian partners, that are a prerequisite before we're in a position to announce a nominee publicly. In this case, we've been gratified to hear of the reception to her nomination. Of course, we've heard a very positive response from our Ukrainian partners. And today, for those of you who are watching Secretary Blinken on the Hill, you heard again a very positive and welcome reception to the news from members of Congress, who we hope will be in a position to take up her nomination very shortly.
Now, just to check on the Lviv thing, no one went in yesterday?
Today was the first day.
You
Yeah,
mentioned
that's what I'm at.
Quick follow-up
For
on that.
those people, but did anyone go in yesterday, on Monday?
Today was the first day that we had embassy officers.
Anyone, well, okay.
That's right.
Embassy
They returned at night.
Correct, yes.
you mentioned traveling on embassy. Is it a trip?
Let me take a couple, one more question on Ukraine?
Ukraine.
Simon, let's move it around.
Yeah, the Secretary has spoken, including on the Hill today, about the war entering a different phase. And obviously this is something that was discussed in the meeting with Zelensky, with the other Ukrainian officials. In terms of what new weapons are required by the Ukrainians for this new phase, you've spoken about howitzers, long-range artillery. Are there any other types of weaponry that they're particularly asking for and that you're considering giving any more sophisticated systems than that?
Well, I think it would start by saying that we've already provided sophisticated systems directly, or facilitated the provision of sophisticated systems directly in response to what our Ukrainian partners have been asking for. And it is a regular staple of our engagement with our Ukrainian partners that they update us on their particular needs. And those needs are different now than they were in the earliest days and hours of the invasion, because as you alluded to, Russia's aggression is shifting from its initial ambitions to take the capital city, its initial ambitions to engage in successful urban warfare, to now the campaign for the South and the East. And so as Russia's war aims have shifted after they've been defeated in their initial aspirations, the nature of our assistance has changed as well in terms of the capabilities and the systems that we are providing them. When Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken met with President Zelensky and his team in Kyiv on Sunday, there was a discussion of the battlefield and precisely what implications that battlefield holds for Ukrainian needs. You heard from Secretary Blinken in the aftermath of that we had, we're going to be in a position to provide hundreds of millions of dollars more in FMF, foreign military financing. This is separate and distinct from the presidential drawdowns that you've heard us put forward in previous weeks, but it is equally useful, and in many ways it gives our Ukrainian partners flexibility in terms of what it is that they are procuring from the United States for their defensive needs against this Russian aggression. Secretary Blinken also announced more than $150 million or so in terms of ammunition. The Department of Defense has talked about the artillery, the systems that the Ukrainians have requested for the battle for the Donbass, and I'll defer to the DoD to
Question
speak to
about the
that.
German tanks.
Sure.
Which is, finally the Germans today agreed to send their tanks. Well, now according to Reuters, Switzerland is refusing to approve the re-export of the ammo needed for those tanks. Is there anything that the US can do with Switzerland to try to smooth this out, given how long Ukraine has been waiting for the German?
Well, Germany has been an important partner, an important member of the coalition that we have put together not only in recent weeks, but over the course of recent months. And we welcome Germany's announcements over the course of months that it will increase defense spending, bolster defense capability and readiness, its announcement that it had halted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and its transfer of lethal assistance and now heavy weaponry to Ukraine. These bold moves, we think, will strengthen Germany's role as a leader in global security, in line with its diplomatic, economic, development, and humanitarian influence in Europe and around the world. It's not for us to speak to specific systems or assets or capabilities that any other country is providing, so I'll leave it to our German allies to speak to what it is precisely that they're providing, and I would have to refer you to the Swiss government for any discussions between those two governments. Yes.
Georgia participated in every peace mission and is a valuable NATO partner. Having this in mind, can Georgia get any tentative dates regarding its aspirations to become a NATO EU member? We all have heard that it's a consensus-based decision, but don't you think the Georgian people and government deserve to know how much longer they need to wait instead of being told that it will happen someday? And second question, please. You say you understand Georgia's position very well, but it's fact that there are both some opposition members inside of my country and also inside of my country who are trying to nudge Georgia toward a decidedly radical position on this. And this is happening in parallel to the ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine. In our partner country, there was even talk of opening up a second front in Russia. On Russia, and this is being advised to a country that together with Moldova faces the greatest risk of renewed Russian aggression. As you know, 20% of my country is occupied by Russia. What objectives do you think this campaign for more radical stance and increased pressure on the Georgian government serve? This has been, as I said, inside of my country and outside of my country, I mean opposition members. And this campaign is permeated with so much disinformation, the so-called secret recordings that are paraded as scandalous or exclusive, while neither in the case.
Thank you. So on your first question, we have said for some 15 years now that we support Georgia's NATO aspirations. We believe that NATO's open door policy, it should be an open door for those countries that aspire to join the alliance. We've also said that no outside entity can or should have a veto on any eligible country's aspirations to join the NATO membership. Now, as you alluded to in your question, the membership process, it is a process that is overseen by the alliance. These will be alliance decisions. There are a set of requirements that any aspirant country will need to fulfill before being eligible to be considered for full membership. But Georgia already is an important NATO partner. We have had close consultations with Georgia on the margins of NATO meetings. And to your second question, and this bridges the two, we have consistently stood by Georgia and with the people of Georgia and their desire to be a free and sovereign people in a free and sovereign country. And over the years, from the earliest days of Georgia's post-Soviet independence, we have now developed a strategic partnership between our countries. We work together towards our shared vision of a Georgia that is fully integrated into the Euro-Atlantic family of nations and part of a Europe that is whole, free, and we would hope at peace. And this is a vision that takes hard work, it takes patience, it takes significant resources to realize. That's why we have sought to do our part. We have allocated almost $6 billion in assistance funds to Georgia. We've trained over 20,000 Georgian soldiers. We've sent over 6,000 people to the United States for cultural and educational exchange programs. We've helped promote economic growth, the rule of law, democratic governance, many other initiatives that are important to the Georgian people and their aspirations, but important interests of ours as well. And so we'll continue to partner with Georgia on their aspirations, on their ambitions, and to protect what they've been able to achieve. Jenny, I'll go back to you.
Thank you very much. On the North Korea, I have two questions also in North Korea. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un mentioned the preemptive use of their nuclear weapons at a military parade in Pyongyang yesterday. Regarding Kim Jong-un's emphasis on the use of nuclear force rather than dialogue for abandoning the nuclear program, how can you assessing the prospect for future dialogue with North Korea? And I follow up next question.
Well, to start, your reference to Kim Jong-un's speech yesterday at the military parade, we're aware of what he said. It reiterates our assessment that the DPRK constitutes a threat to international peace and security and to the global non-proliferation regime. We have a vital interest together with our allies and partners around the world, but especially those in the Indo-Pacific, to deter the DPRK, to defend against its provocations or its use of force, to limit the reach of its most dangerous weapons programs, and above all, to keep safe American people in the region, our deployed forces, and our allies, Japan and the ROK being two of them. Our goal remains the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. As you've heard me say before, and as recently as last week, we harbor no hostile intent toward the DPRK. We do remain open to engaging in diplomacy and dialogue with the DPRK with an aim of achieving progress towards that overall objective. But we also have an obligation to address the recent provocations that we've seen from the DPRK, including its two recent ICBM launches. We have an obligation to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions that are in place. Those are obligations that we'll continue to work on very closely with our allies in the region, with our partners in the region, and with our allies and partners at the UN. And it goes without saying, of course, that our commitment to our treaty allies, Japan and the ROK, is ironclad and remains that way.
Second question, according to a recent exchange of a personal letter between South Korean President Moon and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, in this letter, North Korea contains preconditions for dialogue with South Korea. What is your assessment of the sincerity of Kim Jong-un's personal letter?
It's not for me to assess the sincerity of anything that has come from the DPRK. What we've said before is that we support inter-Korean dialogue. We support anything that de-escalates tensions and that moves us closer towards our shared objective with the ROK, and that's the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Joseph.
Thanks. Secretary Blinken was asked multiple times today about the Vienna talks and nuclear deal. He used very intricate language multiple times when it came to the FTO designation and specifying the Quds force. Can you give us any updates on where those are? Are there, is there anything scheduled, any meeting scheduled back in Vienna? And is that what's holding up the deal right now? Is it the FTO designation on the IRGC or the IRGC Quds force?
We don't have any travel to Vienna to preview. We are in close contact with the EU coordinator who continues to convey messages back and forth. We continue, as you heard me say just the other day, we remain hopeful that an agreement can be reached, but it can be reached only if Iran is prepared to conclude a deal without, for example, raising issues that are extraneous to the JCPOA. If that's the case, we believe that we can achieve a mutual return to compliance of the JCPOA in fairly short order. And that remains our goal for a couple of reasons. You heard the Secretary speak to this today. It remains our goal principally because President Biden has a commitment to see to it that Iran is never in a position to acquire a nuclear weapon. And the fact is that while the JCPOA was in full effect from implementation day in early 2016 until May of 2018, Iran was verifiably and permanently prevented from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And again, when the JCPOA was in full effect, the breakout time, that is to say, the time that Iran would require to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon if it chose to go in that direction was about 12 months when the deal was consummated and fully in effect. Now, and the Secretary said this today, that breakout time is measured not in months, but unfortunately in weeks. And that is something that is unacceptable to us as a long-term proposition. That is why we continue to see if we can reach a conclusion, a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. But as we've said, we're preparing equally for either world, a world in which we have a JCPOA and a world in which we are forced to seek other means to be faithful to the president's commitment. Now, the challenge is we've seen both of these worlds. We've seen what a world with a fully functioning JCPOA looks like. And again, that's a world in which Iran is verifiably and permanently constrained from obtaining a nuclear weapon with a breakout time that is extended. And we've seen a world without a JCPOA. So this is not a thought experiment. Unfortunately, there's been a real world experiment when it comes to the utility of the JCPOA. And in the world in which the JCPOA has been suspended, not only have we seen Iran's nuclear program gallop forward with the installation of centrifuges, the accumulation of nuclear material, various developments that would contravene the obligations under the JCPOA, but we've seen Iran that has acted with even greater impunity. We've seen an Iran that has enabled its proxies, that has supported malevolent groups and actors in the region. We've seen an Iran that has continued with its ballistic missile program. We've seen an Iran that has continued to be a deeply destabilizing force to the region. We believe that if we are able to put Iran's nuclear program back into a box, if we are able to contain what would constitute the greatest challenge we could face from Iran, the greatest challenge we could face in the region, that we will be more effective and better positioned to confront these other challenges that we face with Iran. So there's some distance yet to close. It's unclear if we're going to be able to get there, but it remains our assessment that mutually returning to the JCPOA would profoundly be in our interest, and we'll pursue that mutual return as long as it remains in our interest.
You mentioned yourself months ago that this wouldn't be open-ended. And I mean, the talks have been going on for a little over a year. Granted, I mean, it's not an easy agreement to reach, but I mean, surely, and you guys have also been saying that the breakout time is a matter of weeks for now months. So I mean, how much longer are you guys willing to wait? Because it seems like, you know, Iran's has its demands and they're not backing down.
Well, we're going to test the proposition of a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA for as long as doing so remains in our interests. And the fact is that right now, Iran's breakout time, it is far shorter than we would like. Were we to re-enter the JCPOA and more precisely, were Iran to once again be subject to the most stringent verification and monitoring regime ever negotiated, that breakout time would be extended. So as long as the non-proliferation benefits that a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA brings is better than what we have now, that will likely be an outcome that's in our interest. But again, we may not be able to get there because a negotiation, in this case, not only does it take two parties, but there are multiple parties in this, and there are complex questions, some of which remain unresolved.
And on this, and I'll leave aside the argument that we could get into over whether everyone agrees that the JCPOA permanently and verifiably ended the nuclear potential, Iran's nuclear potential, leaving that aside. The Secretary seemed to suggest in his answers today that the State Department and the DNI had made a determination that the threat against former Secretary Pompeo and Special Envoy Book from Iran continued, and that you are continuing to pay whatever amount it is per month for protection for them. Is that correct? Is that a correct reading of what he said?
There is only so much I can say on this, but we have an obligation that we take very seriously to provide protection to former officials of this building who may be subject to a threat. Now, I think you could understand why If someone were in fact subject to a foreign threat, we probably wouldn't want to speak to that publicly so as not to spotlight something like that, to spotlight measures we might be taking to mitigate any such threat. But you heard this from the National Security Advisor on January 9th, I think it was, of this year. He issued a very clear statement.
Yes, but after that, and I remember that, and I appreciate the fact that he said that, but after that, you guys notified the Hill that you were spending $2 million a month roughly for protection for these two former officials. And also that a decision had to be made within 10 days of that notification, whether or not you were gonna ask for more money to continue that protection. And it sounded to me, from what the secretary said, that you had made that decision.
We notify the Hill of many things that we're not in a position to speak about publicly. Let me move around just, yes, please.
Can I just follow up on Iran?
Quick follow-up on Iran,
Very
okay.
quick follow-up on Iran. The Times of Israel reported that Israeli officials are saying that the Americans have basically acknowledged the failure of the Vienna talks, and you're about to make that public in a very short order. Can you comment on that?
My comment would be precise to the answer that I offered to Joseph just a moment ago. That we are going to pursue a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA as long as it remains in our national interest to do so.
So the Israelis in this case are wrong, exaggerating that.
It sounds like you're citing a press report that's citing anonymous Israelis. So oftentimes that is a recipe for information that may not be entirely accurate.
Iran
Yes.
question.
Okay.
Sorry, I just want to build off what Joseph was asking you. Can you just explain to us how the breakout time has remained weeks for months now? It seems to indicate that Iran has slowed down accelerating its program, has done it more slowly than you expected it to. Is that the case? Can you just explain how we're in the same place we were in January, February?
Well, the breakout time is an assessment. It's an assessment based on our technical know-how. It's an assessment that is based on non-public sources of information as well. So there's only so much we can say on this. But I don't think it's fair to say that the Iranians are or feel constrained right now in terms of their nuclear program. And that's precisely why we are still testing the proposition of a potential mutual return to compliance, so that they are constrained by the JCPOA, the constraints that are conveyed by the JCPOA in terms of centrifuges, in terms of amassing nuclear material, in terms of amassing heavy water, in terms of what all of that means for a potential breakout time. Yes.
Thank you, Matt. I have a quick question about China. The Secretary Blinken mentioned today he will speak publicly about comprehensive strategy to deal with China. So the United States has published interim national security strategy and Indo-Pacific strategy already, which are focusing on China in some ways. So could you could you help us understand what the difference between the incoming strategy and ongoing strategies?
So the Secretary did mention that he expected to have an opportunity in the coming days, coming weeks, to speak in a bit more depth to our approach to the PRC. I think what you're referring to when you mention our Indo-Pacific strategy, this was a strategy that Secretary Blinken laid out on a fairly memorable trip for those of you who were with us in Jakarta late last year, in December of last year. And our Indo-Pacific strategy, as the name suggests, is focused on the broader region, is focused on principally our partnership with the region and our shared vision with and for the region. It's a vision of a region that is centered on key elements. First, advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific in which problems are dealt with openly, rules will be reached transparently and applied fairly, goods and ideas, people will flow freely. Second, it's about forging stronger connections within and beyond the region on a bilateral basis or on a multilateral basis if you talk about the Quad, or stitching together our partnerships and alliances if you were to talk about, for example, an AUKUS. Third, it's a vision that promotes broad-based prosperity for the region, again, with us as a partner, knowing that the region is home to some 40% of global GDP. It's a region of opportunity, not only for the people of the region, but also for the United States. It's a vision that seeks to build a more resilient Indo-Pacific, resilience against COVID, resilience against climate change, resilience against shared threats. And finally, it's a region in which we seek to bolster security. And there are any number of threats. And when it comes to our assessment, our system of alliances and partnerships is the most important tool we have when it comes to confronting those threats. So it's a vision principally for a broader region. We've talked about our approach to the PRC. We've talked about the multifaceted relationship we have with the PRC, but I know that the Secretary looks forward in the coming days to speaking a bit more about that.
Can I ask a quick
yes.
question on,
Yep.
on Palestinian-Israeli issue? Ned, it's been 6 months since the 6 organizations were designated as terrorist organizations. I know I've asked you this question many times before, so please indulge me, you know. So, and I know that you requested clarification from the Israelis, and you received that clarification. Are you satisfied that these organizations, these 6 organizations, are in fact engaged in terrorist activities? You know, because their funding has been cut off. The European Union is looking at, maybe there's been experts today, UN experts that said they should be funded. There's been no evidence that they have engaged in terrorist activity. What is your assessment after the Israelis responded to you?
As I've said for some time now, Saeed, our Israeli partners have provided us with information regarding the basis for the determination. That's information that we're reviewing. It's a process that can be lengthy because it's a process that takes place not only here in this building, but also across other departments and agencies across town. I can say more broadly that we've made it very clear to our Israeli government and Palestinian Authority interlocutors that independent civil society organizations in the West Bank and in Israel must be able to continue their important work. We value the monitoring of human rights violations and abuses that independent NGOs undertake in Gaza, undertake in the West Bank, undertake in Israel and elsewhere. And we strongly believe that respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and a strong civil society are critically important to responsive democratic governance. It's also important to note that we have already we long ago designated the PFLP as an FTO. They have been designated as an FTO since 1997. And we've not designated, as you know, any of the 6 NGOs that the Israeli government did. It's also important to note we haven't funded these groups.
But the PFLP is one thing, and these organizations is another thing altogether. I mean, I understand that you have designated the PFLP a long time ago as a terrorist organization. And there's maybe a good reason for that, I don't know. But on these 6 organizations, they have conducted themselves only in terms of human rights abuses, reporting on that, you know, doing civil society organizations and so on.
That's something we're looking at.
Ned,
Ned.
on Israel, you presume that you've seen these very lengthy regulations that were dated February, but apparently take effect in May for entry by foreigners into the West Bank?
I'm not immediately familiar with them, but if we have a reaction, we'll let you know.
Yeah, because it would require foreigners of any nationality to get prior approval from Israeli military officials at the embassy where they're applying for a visa before they can even present themselves for entry into the West Bank. So yes, I'd be very interested in any reaction you have, and also if this will have any impact on the visa waiver negotiations, because as you know, one of the main sticking points in that has been the treatment of Palestinian Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon.
I just wanted to try and clarify something. The Indo-Pacific strategy that you were mentioning, I think the exchange that took place on the Hill earlier, the Secretary was being asked about a formal national security strategy on China. And your response just now, you seem to suggest he will address this issue in coming weeks, but there isn't a separate strategy for China that's forthcoming. Can you just clarify? He's going to address something in coming weeks, but it's not going to be
The question was how remarks on the PRC might be different from the Indo-Pacific strategy that the Secretary explained in December of last year. And so my answer was the fact that that was a regional strategy. It wasn't about any one country. It was about our partnership with the region and our bilateral relationships with the countries of the region and the relationships we have bilaterally and multilaterally with blocs in the region as well.
So the Secretary will detail a specific strategy for China.
The Secretary looks forward to speaking more about our approach to the PRC in the coming days.
Question on-
Final question? Yes.
Yeah, actually, two questions on Ukraine. First, to clarify on what you just said in your response to Connor's question on embassy. You mentioned traveling. Are the diplomats going back and forth? Is it like day-long trip? Do you have any timeline on when the embassy in Kiev will be restaffed? And my second question after.
They are making, for the time being, day trips into Lviv. That first day trip started today. As I said before, we are accelerating planning to reestablish a diplomatic presence at our embassy in Kyiv. It is something we want to do as soon as it is responsible for us to do so.
Awesome. And second question on the last weekend's meeting. There are reports that Zelensky handed over a plan to strengthen sanctions. It's about wrapping up sanctions against Russia and enablers. Are you in a position to confirm those reports?
Well, I think there are reports because in the Ukrainian government readout, it said that President Zelensky handed over a document regarding the Yermak McFall International Expert Group on strengthening sanctions. So sanctions enforcement, the next step in our sanctions against Russia and those who are enabling the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, that certainly was a topic of discussion, and we'll continue to coordinate closely with our Ukrainian partners on that. Thank you.
Thanks.